My brother moved into my house for 1 month. He tried to kick me out instead. My brother Jake called me on a Sunday evening, his voice tight with the specific kind of stress that meant something had already gone wrong before he'd worked up the nerve to ask for help. His landlord had sold the building he'd been renting in, the new owners were converting the units to short-term rentals, and he had exactly 3 weeks to find somewhere new to live. He asked if he could stay with me just temporarily, just until he found a new apartment. He said it would be a month, maybe 6 weeks at the absolute most. I own a 3-bedroom house about 20 minutes outside the city, bought 4 years earlier with a combination of savings and a modest inheritance from our grandfather, the kind of house that felt genuinely too big for one person most days, with a spare bedroom that mostly sat empty except when friends visited from out of town. Jake and I had always had a relationship defined more by proximity than closeness, 3 years apart, similar enough in upbringing but different enough in temperament that we'd never been the kind of brothers who called each other just to talk. He worked in freelance graphic design, project to project, the kind of income that fluctuated enough to make stability a constant background concern in his life, even in good months. I worked in software, salaried, predictable, the kind of steady paycheck that let me buy a house at 31 while Jake, at 29, was still renting 1-bedroom apartments and living paycheck to paycheck more often than either of us ever discussed directly. I didn't think much about that gap between us most of the time. It simply was what it was, the natural result of two brothers who'd chosen different careers with different risk profiles. Saying yes to Jake felt like an easy decision at the time. He was my brother, he needed help, and I had the space to give it. 1 month, I said, mostly to make sure we were both on the same page. Maybe a little longer if you need it, but let's plan around 1 month, okay? That gives you time to find something without rushing into a bad lease. 1 month, he agreed. I promise, I'll be out of your hair before you know it. Jake moved in that following weekend with 2 carloads of belongings and a level of gratitude that in retrospect I should have paid more attention to fading as the weeks went on. The first 2 weeks were easy enough. He kept mostly to the spare bedroom, contributed to groceries without being asked, seemed genuinely motivated to find a new place, sending me screenshots of apartment listings he was considering, asking my opinion on neighborhoods. I remember feeling, during those first 2 weeks, a kind of quiet satisfaction at how smoothly it was going, how easy it felt to help my brother through a rough patch, without any of the friction I'd half expected from 2 adult men suddenly sharing a house again after years of living independently. We fell into an easy rhythm, him cooking dinner 2 nights a week as a way of contributing, me handling the grocery runs on weekends, both of us respecting each other's space in the evenings. I even mentioned to a coworker during that stretch how glad I was that Jake had reached out to me instead of trying to figure things out entirely on his own, how nice it felt to actually be useful to my brother for once instead of just existing in parallel to his life the way we mostly had as adults. Around week 3, the apartment search updates started slowing down. I didn't think much of it initially. Apartment hunting takes time, and I wasn't going to nag my brother about a search I'd told him he had a full month to complete. By week 5, a full 2 weeks past our original agreement, the updates had stopped almost entirely, replaced by vague comments about the market being tougher than expected and how he was still weighing options. I brought it up directly during a Sunday dinner we'd fallen into a habit of sharing, just the two of us since he'd moved in. Hey, we're a little past the month mark. What's the actual status on the apartment search? Jake's expression shifted into something I hadn't seen from him before, a kind of defensive irritation that felt disproportionate to what I'd actually asked. I'm working on it. It's not like apartments just fall into your lap. I have specific requirements. I get that, I said, trying to keep my tone light. I'm not trying to rush you unnecessarily. I just want to make sure we're still on the same page about the timeline we agreed on. We agreed on about a month, he said, an edge creeping into his voice that surprised me. I don't think you should be treating this like some kind of strict deadline. I'm your brother, not a tenant. That comment, I'm your brother, not a tenant, became, in hindsight, the first real signal of a dynamic that would only get stranger over the following months. Jake seemed to want the benefits of living in my house rent-free indefinitely, while simultaneously resisting any framing that suggested his presence there came with actual expectations or timelines, as though the word brother alone exempted him from the basic terms we'd explicitly agreed to before he ever moved a single box through my front door. By month 3, I stopped seeing apartment listings from him at all. He'd settled fully into the spare bedroom, moved in furniture of his own that replaced pieces I'd originally had in there, started referring to it in casual conversation with mutual friends as his room in a way that made my stomach tighten every time I overheard it. His contributions to groceries, once consistent, became sporadic, then stopped almost entirely, replaced by vague promises to settle up soon that never quite materialized into an actual transfer of money. I noticed other small shifts too, the kind of accumulating changes that felt insignificant individually but added up to something larger in retrospect. He started having his own mail forwarded to my address instead of using a temporary solution. He got a library card using my address as his residence. He mentioned once, almost in passing, that he'd told his own landlord search agency to stop sending listings for a while because he was reassessing his timeline, a phrase that struck me, even then, as strangely formal for what was supposed to be a short-term living situation between brothers. My friends who visited during that stretch started asking, gently, how long Jake was planning to stay, questions I found myself deflecting with increasing discomfort, because I genuinely didn't have a clear answer anymore, and admitting that out loud felt like admitting I'd lost control of my own household. One friend, Marcus, who'd stayed with me for a weekend during month 3, pulled me aside before he left and told me, bluntly, that something about the dynamic in the house felt off to him, that Jake had made an offhand comment during dinner about eventually redoing the guest bathroom, in a tone that suggested a much longer horizon than a temporary stay. I brushed it off at the time, told Marcus he was probably reading too much into a passing comment, though some part of me had already noted the same unease myself and simply hadn't wanted to give it real weight yet. I tried several times over those months to have direct conversations about the situation, each one met with a slightly different version of deflection. Sometimes it was Jake claiming he was in the middle of a promising lead on an apartment that would surely come through any week now. Sometimes it was an appeal to family loyalty, a reminder that I had plenty of space, and it wasn't costing me much to let him stay a little longer. Once memorably, he tried to reframe the entire arrangement as beneficial to me, pointing out that having someone else in the house meant I wasn't paying the full utility bill alone, as though this justified an indefinite, unpaid extension of an agreement that had explicitly been temporary from the start. I brought the situation up with our parents during a phone call around month 4, hoping for support, or at least validation that what I was experiencing was a reasonable thing to be frustrated about. "He's your brother," my mother said, in the tone she always used when she wanted to shut down a complaint before it had really started. "You have the space. What's the actual harm in letting him stay a bit longer while he gets on his feet?" "The harm is that he agreed to 1 month, Mom, and it's been 4. He stopped even pretending to look for his own place. He stopped contributing to groceries. He acts irritated any time I bring up the original timeline we agreed on. I'm sure he's just going through a hard time," she said. "Try to be patient with him." I hung up the call feeling the familiar, frustrating sensation of watching my own legitimate concern get reframed, gently but firmly, as a character flaw in me rather than a real issue with Jake's behavior, a pattern I recognized uncomfortably from other moments in our family's history, where my own reasonable boundaries had a way of getting quietly relabeled as impatience or selfishness whenever they became inconvenient for someone else. The real turning point came in month 5, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday evening, when I came home from work to find Jake sitting at my kitchen table with what looked like a printed document in front of him. "We need to talk about something," he said, sliding the paper toward me. It was a proposed roommate agreement. Not a temporary arrangement acknowledging he was overstaying a 1-month favor, but a formal document outlining shared responsibilities, split utility costs, and a monthly contribution toward the mortgage, one that notably was far below what any reasonable market rent for a room in that house would have actually been. The document was dated, formatted, clearly something he'd put real time into preparing, and it took me a moment to fully absorb what I was looking at, because the framing was so far removed from the actual history of how he'd come to be living there in the first place. I read through the document twice, my confusion slowly curdling into something closer to disbelief. It included a clause about 90 days' notice for either party to end the arrangement, language about shared use of common spaces, even a proposed schedule for splitting yard work, all formatted with a kind of bureaucratic confidence that suggested Jake had genuinely convinced himself this was a reasonable next step in our arrangement, rather than a significant escalation of an agreement he'd already broken by 4 months and counting. "Jake, this isn't a roommate situation. This is my house. You were supposed to stay for 1 month while you found your own place. That was 5 months ago," he said, as though the passage of time itself had somehow converted an explicit temporary agreement into a permanent one by default. "I live here now. I think it makes sense to formalize things so we both know where we stand." "I know exactly where I stand," I said. "I own this house." "You were a guest who overstayed an agreement by 4 months without any real explanation beyond vague apartment searches that stopped happening months ago." Jake's expression hardened into something I genuinely hadn't seen from him before, not in this entire ordeal, not really ever in our whole relationship as brothers. "I don't think it's that simple anymore. I've been living here for 5 months. I've built a life around this place. You can't just decide out of nowhere that I need to leave immediately. That's not fair, and honestly, depending on how you handle this, it might not even be legal." I want to be clear about how disorienting that sentence was to hear from my own brother in my own kitchen in the house I had bought and paid for myself. "Legal," I repeated. "You're telling me it might not be legal for me to ask you to leave my own house?" "There are tenant protections," he said with a confidence that told me he'd actually researched this, actually prepared for a conversation where I might push back. "Depending on how long someone's lived somewhere and whether there's been any kind of financial arrangement, courts can sometimes treat it like an actual tenancy even without a formal lease." I looked into it. "I'm not saying I want this to get complicated. I'm just saying you should think carefully before you try to just kick me out." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift in me that I can only describe as a specific, cold clarity, replacing the confused frustration I'd been operating under for the previous several months. My own brother, who I'd let move into my home rent-free out of genuine care for his situation, had apparently spent some portion of those 5 months researching how to potentially claim tenant status against me, rather than researching apartments the way he'd told me repeatedly that he was doing. I thought sitting there about all the evenings over the previous months, when I'd assumed Jake was simply having bad luck in a tough rental market, when in reality, based on what was unfolding in front of me now, he might have been spending at least some of that time reading up on landlord-tenant law instead, quietly building a case for himself in the event I ever pushed back too hard. It was a strange, specific kind of betrayal, not dramatic in the way some family conflicts are, but deeply unsettling in how calculated it felt once I saw it clearly, especially set against the version of Jake I'd believed I was helping, the earnest, grateful brother from those first 2 weeks, sending me apartment listings, cooking dinner twice a week, seemingly as invested in a quick, smooth transition as I was. "Get out your phone," I said. "I want to show you something." I pulled up the text messages from the night he'd first called me, the ones where he'd explicitly said 1 month, maybe 6 weeks at the absolute most, the ones where I'd responded in writing, 1 month, maybe a little longer if you need it, but let's plan around 1 month. I read them out loud slowly, watching his expression shift as he heard, in his own words, the terms he now seemed to be trying to quietly erase. "It doesn't change anything," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Verbal agreements or texts don't necessarily override how courts look at actual living arrangements over time." "Maybe not," I said, "but it changes how I'm going to handle this, starting right now." I contacted a lawyer the following morning, wanting clear, accurate information rather than continuing to operate on Jake's selectively researched version of tenant law. What I learned was more nuanced than either Jake's implied threat or my own initial assumption that I could simply ask him to leave immediately without any formal process. Because he had, in fact, been living there for 5 months, with some informal financial contributions early on, there was a real possibility that a court could view the arrangement as having created some tenancy rights, meaning I likely needed to provide formal written notice and follow proper procedures rather than simply changing the locks or removing his belongings myself, however justified that impulse felt in the moment. The lawyer walked me through the specifics carefully, explaining that the exact threshold for what constitutes an informal tenancy varies, but that the combination of duration, receiving mail at the address, and even sporadic financial contributions could all be used to argue Jake had established residency rights that a court might recognize, regardless of our original 1-month agreement. She also pointed out something that stung more than I expected it to, that Jake's decision to have his mail forwarded and get a library card using my address, small details I'd barely registered as significant at the time, could actually function as supporting evidence for exactly the kind of claim he'd implied he might make, whether or not he'd consciously collected them with that purpose in mind. That reality was frustrating to sit with, knowing that my own generosity, extended in good faith to my brother during a genuine housing crisis, had potentially created legal complications that a stranger renting a room under a proper lease would never have created for me, specifically because I'd trusted a family member enough not to formalize things from the start. I followed the lawyer's guidance precisely. I provided Jake with formal written notice, a specific date by which he needed to vacate, sent through certified mail to ensure there was a clear, documented record. I also, at the lawyer's suggestion, changed the conversation with my parents, sending them copies of the original text messages alongside the formal notice, wanting them to understand in clear terms exactly what had transpired rather than continuing to operate on whatever softened version Jake might have been sharing with them. My mother called almost immediately after receiving that, her tone entirely different from our earlier conversations. "I had no idea it had gotten this serious," she said. "Jake made it sound like you two were just working out some minor scheduling disagreement." "It's not a minor scheduling disagreement, Mom. He tried to imply I might not legally be able to remove him from my own house, after living there 5 months longer than we agreed to, without contributing anything close to fair rent for most of that time." The formal notice, once served, shifted the entire dynamic in the house in a way that months of informal conversations never had. Jake, confronted with an actual legal timeline and the clear, documented proof of our original agreement, stopped arguing the tenant rights angle almost entirely, retreating instead into a wounded, resentful silence that lasted for most of the final 2 weeks he remained in the house. Those final 2 weeks were some of the strangest of the entire ordeal, two brothers living under the same roof, barely speaking, moving carefully around each other's schedules to avoid overlap in the kitchen or living room. I remember one evening coming home to find him sitting in the living room watching television, and neither of us saying more than a clipped hello before I retreated to my own bedroom rather than sit through another silence that felt heavier than any argument would have. Part of me wanted to try to bridge that silence, to remind him that none of this had to end this coldly, that I still cared about him even if I was furious about how he'd handled the situation. But another part of me, the part that had spent 5 months being quietly taken advantage of by someone who'd apparently researched how to legally resist leaving, wasn't ready yet to extend that particular olive branch, not while he was still living under my roof on a countdown he clearly resented. He moved out 3 days before the deadline in my formal notice, into a studio apartment he'd apparently had lined up for weeks but had been quietly sitting on rather than signing. I later learned from a mutual friend, specifically because staying in my house rent-free had simply been more comfortable and more affordable than committing to a lease of his own. Our relationship has been distant since then, in a way I don't fully know how to repair or if I even want to right now. Jake sent one text a few weeks after moving out, short and clipped, saying he thought I'd handled things pretty coldly for a brother. I didn't respond to that message for several days, and when I finally did, I kept it simple. I told him that offering someone your home during a genuine crisis, only to have that generosity quietly reframed into an indefinite, unpaid arrangement defended with researched legal threats, wasn't the kind of thing that made me interested in reflecting on my own coldness. If anything, I told him, I'd learned an important lesson about the difference between helping someone through a hard month and accidentally enabling someone to avoid ever facing the consequences of their own inertia. My parents and I talked through the whole situation more thoroughly once they'd seen the actual documentation, and my mother eventually acknowledged, somewhat sheepishly, that she'd taken Jake's version of events at face value without asking enough questions, a pattern I recognized uncomfortably as one that had shaped a lot of my relationship with my family over the years. My father, for his part, admitted that he hadn't fully grasped how long Jake had actually been staying without contributing anything close to fair rent, having assumed, based on Jake's own framing, that the arrangement was closer to 2 or 3 months rather than 5. I've started, since all of this happened, being more deliberate about documenting agreements even with people I trust completely, not because I expect every family member to eventually try to claim tenant rights against me, but because I learned, the hard way, that good faith and clear boundaries aren't actually opposites. If anything, having clear terms in writing from the very beginning might have spared both Jake and me the 5 months of slow-building resentment that eventually exploded into something neither of us handled particularly well. A cousin of mine, hearing the full story secondhand months later, asked me if I regretted ever saying yes to Jake in the first place, whether I wished I'd simply told him to figure out his own housing crisis without involving me at all. I told her no, honestly. I don't regret offering help during a genuine emergency. What I regret, if anything, is not having a single direct, uncomfortable conversation earlier, sometime around week 6 or 7, when the pattern was already becoming visible, instead of letting 5 months of accumulating resentment build until it exploded into a kitchen table showdown over a document that should never have needed to exist between two brothers in the first place. I think, looking back, that's usually how these things go wrong, not through one dramatic betrayal, but through a slow accumulation of small, unaddressed moments that eventually calcify into something much harder to untangle than any single conversation, had early enough, ever would have been. It's a lesson I've tried to carry forward into other parts of my life since then, this idea that kindness without any structure at all isn't really kindness in the long run. It's just an open door that anyone, even someone you love, might eventually walk further through than either of you ever intended. Jake and I still don't talk much, though we've exchanged a few civil texts around holidays since then, nothing warm exactly, but nothing hostile either, just two brothers slowly figuring out what, if anything, remains of a relationship that survived something neither of us handled particularly gracefully. I don't know if we'll ever fully get back to where we were before that Sunday phone call. Some part of me isn't even sure I want to, not until I see something concrete from him that suggests he's actually reckoned with what he tried to do, rather than simply moved on quietly the way our whole family seems to prefer doing with anything uncomfortable.